Hi guys, this is Andrew with headphones.com. Welcome to the Headphone Show, and today we're going to be talking about this. This is the Ampsandsound Kenzie tube amplifier, and it comes in just under $2,000. Let's check it out. As a disclaimer, this is a demo unit that was sent over for evaluation by Ampsandsound, but I'm not being paid to say anything in particular about it, and of course all thoughts and opinions are my own. But big thanks to Ampsandsound for sending this over for review. Now, as we get going with this review, I do want to let you guys know that I am from more the solid state side of things. That's sort of where my background is, and in the last year and a bit, I've really been diving into the tube rabbit hole and learning what I can about it. But I don't have the tools here to measure amplifiers. So really the only sort of objective data stuff that I can talk about is what the downstream effects are of using a device like this. So this review is going to be essentially just my subjective take and more focused on the sound that I hear and the sound quality, and less about, any of the sort of data-driven objective measurement stuff that I normally like to, try and add and correlate. So this is a purely subjective review, which is also fun to do because this is kind of the most important thing to me. It's what the experience is. So without further ado, let's get into it. And let's talk first about what this is and then what this is not. Also, I'm going to put this down now because this is really heavy. So yes, the Kenzie is the amplifier that I've had in the background for many of my other reviews on the shelf back there, and it's the amplifier that I've been using more than anything else. And the reason for that is because it sounds incredible. Ampsandsound is a company headed by Justin Weber, who is one of the most interesting people to talk to and most knowledgeable people about amplifiers and just anything to do with headphone amplifiers and just headphones in general. He is to tube amplifiers what Zach Merbach is to high-end wooden dynamic driver headphones. And to the surprise of absolutely nobody, ZMF headphones do work really well with Ampsandsound amps, and that should make sense. ZMF has the pendant, which is something that they've done in collaboration with Ampsandsound. And I do want to mention Ampsandsound is a company that has been doing a lot of stuff with tube amps for speakers as well. So they're not just making headphone amplifiers, but they do have a line of headphone amplifiers, of which the Kenzie is sort of the starting point. So what is it? The Ampsandsound Kenzie is a single-ended tube amp with no feedback. Well, this uses a 1626 tube, which is a World War II era tube that was used as a transmitter tube in radio installations, which is kind of cool. And then the input tube is a 12SL7 or equivalent. And as I show you guys the back of this, there are two outputs on this amplifier. One is low Z and one is high Z. The low is 32 ohms and the high is 300. Now, I'm also led to believe that you can ask for different output impedances depending on the headphones that you have, because say, for example, you have one of the closed-back Focal headphones that have very low impedance when paired with something that has high output impedance, you'll dramatically alter the frequency response there. It'll boost the bass like crazy. So depending on the headphones that you have, you may want to look at that and go, okay, what would work best with the headphones that I have? But I think the default of 32 and 300 makes a certain amount of sense for a wide range of headphones, so there is a certain amount of flexibility there. I will say, though, it's not quite the same as what's going on with the pendant, and I do think that the pendant's output impedance is probably a little bit more appropriate for the 300 ohm ZMF headphones like the Verite, because the Verite does really well with high output impedance sources. It's just that with the 300 ohm out on the Kenzie, you are also bound to get just a little bit of noise floor there. So you would have to use the 32 ohm out on the Kenzie for that. And there are also all kinds of other headphones that even if you run that off the 300 ohm output, there is no noise floor whatsoever. Now let's talk about what the Kenzie is not and what it's not for. So the Kenzie is not an output transformerless amp or OTL amp, like you might find with like a Bottlehead Crack or a Felix Audio Elise. And so while you might see these large tubes there, this is not the same design as an OTL amp. And while it is reasonably versatile, this is not a jack of all trades, master of none kind of amplifier. This is something that's a little bit more specialized. And I've talked about this in the past, even with solid state amplifiers, where you can get one that does sort of everything. And if you have a ton of headphones, you can use one amplifier. It's gonna be very versatile. And then there are other amplifiers that are much more specialized for a specific thing, like for example, inefficient planars. And on that subject, the Ampsandsound Kenzie is not something I'm going to recommend for inefficient planars like the HE6 or Hi-Fi Mansa's Vara or LCD4. But with that said, said, you can still run your, high impedance headphones off of the Kenzie and it'll be fine. And there are a lot of planars that do really well with it. And even when it comes to the sound, there are a lot of planars that I absolutely love with the Kenzie. Lastly, the Kenzie is also not an amplifier that is going to be meant for IEMs or in-ear monitors, at least most of them. I think there are some that might do just fine with that. And in theory, you could if you had the right synergy, but this is not something I'm going to recommend for people who are looking for a source for their IEMs. I think maybe that's obvious, but I just felt like mentioning it because I did try it. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning of this review, I'm not able to objectively measure anything to do with the amplifier specifically because I don't have the tools to do so. However, what I was able to do was measure the downstream effects of the amplifier to see if there was any change in frequency response or anything in my normal measurements. And I can confidently say that there is absolutely no change, regardless of the output that you use, with a certain caveat in there, and it's that if the headphones have a specific type of behavior with different output impedances, you're going to notice that difference. But that's not to do with the fact that it's a tube amplifier, that's just to do with the fact that it's an output impedance synergy difference. And on that note, when I used the 300 ohm Verite off of both outputs and compared the two, I noticed that there was only like maybe a 1 to 2 dB difference in the bass. The 300 ohm output had a little bit more, but again, that's more to do with the synergy that's going on and not at all to do with the tube amp itself. It's not boosting the bass. It's an output impedance thing. And actually, it's remarkable that it stayed as linear and as neutral as it did for both outputs. So you might be thinking to yourself at this point, this is a tube amp and it's totally neutral. What's the point of that? The Ampsandsound Kenzie, as well as the Pendant, are both examples of tube amplifiers that demonstrate that it's not possible to achieve the same kind of sound from this type of tube amplifier by just using digital signal processing. I know that was something that a lot of people have recommended in the past. Don't spend a ton of money on tube amplifiers because you can just, EQ and warm things up and, change the frequency response that way. But because these don't change the frequency response, the question remains, well, what changes? What's different about it? And this is where we're going to get into my subjective take here about the sound, because boy, is it ever different, and in a really good way. Basically, what I'm talking about here is tube character. And before somebody brings up, elevated third and second harmonic, from what I can tell, that's also not really what's going on here. Even though, yes, I'm aware that's sort of how this works. But I actively think that there's more going on there that I simply cannot explain. So what is the tube character of the Ampsandsound Kenzie? Well, unfortunately, this requires a description that makes use of a ton of subjective nonsense audiophile terms. So I'm going to bombard you with that right now. I have no other way of explaining it. When you hear it, you know exactly what I'm talking about. It is tonal richness and presence, and it does have depth and texture similar to what was going on with the Pendant, but it's less about depth and texture than it is about sweetness and euphony and richness of tone for everything. And also microdynamics. There's an extra sense of attention that gets drawn to the finer little gradations of volume that happen. And this is something I was testing with a number of tracks that have sort of individual lines for like guitar tones. And when I was listening for sort of the trailing ends of this, it was as if my attention was being drawn to those finer little nuances in ways that no solid state amplifier has ever been able to do. And because of that, the Kenzie, to my ear, gives the perception of enhanced detail. And that's really what I'm talking about here. So again, comparing it with the Pendant, the ZMF Pendant, it does do many of the same things that the ZMF Pendant does, as far as, you get, it's not that the soundstage is bigger, it's just that the soundstage has more depth to it. And while the Kenzie does affect the soundstage depth in a similar way, it's not to the same degree as the Pendant. So the Pendant is more about the depth there. The best way I think that I can describe the stage is that it's a more involved stage that has the consequence of being potentially a little bit more cluttered, but not in a bad way. So if you imagine that when you're wearing a headphone, the soundstage is normally sort of like all around your head. It's basically you're in a bubble, and the sound is, well, it depends on the headphone, but imagine for a minute that the headphone has this sort of circular presentation around you. With the Kenzie, it's as if every part of the circle is now contoured inwards, so that instead of having a circle around you for sound, the images pop out from different places. But again, the key sound quality feature of the Kenzie is that sort of sweetness and microdynamic definition, and, getting a little bit of extra attention drawn to those finer little nuances. Now, the last thing I want to mention for my subjective take of the sound here is that normally I say that headphones make the biggest difference. Spend most of your money on headphones. Most amplifiers don't sound that different from one another. Even when you go to the really expensive stuff, I mean, yes, they do sound different, but it's not as dramatic a difference as the headphones. And the same thing with DACs, they're even less different. The Kenzie is an exception to this. The Kenzie makes me think you could actually invest more in the amplifier than in the headphones, and it would be worth it. And same thing, I mean, the pendant did have that effect as well, but I almost feel a little bit more as far as that sort of micro detail, kind of extra microdynamic character that it gives it. Now, I'm not saying that this is going to be the best bang for the buck as far as price to performance is concerned. I still think people who are just starting in this hobby should really focus on something like a Sennheiser HD650, 6XX or whatever, or a Hi-Fi Man Sundara and a solid state amplifier. I think that's a great place to start. But as far as how much of an improvement you may get, if you are considering spending that kind of money on a solid state amplifier, this is way closer to, getting a higher end headphone. And that's really why I say this is an exception to that normal idea of headphones make the biggest difference. Because I can listen to the HD650 or 6XX off the SPL Phonitor X or the Kaina HA6, and it can sound great. And then I move to the Kenzie, and it's like, what is this? This is a totally different experience. And one that I really recommend, I think is fantastic. So for the sound quality, it gets a big thumbs up from me. Very easy to recommend. Now, before I end this video, I want to go over a couple of potential barriers to entry when it comes to tube amps in general, but stuff that I noticed with the Kenzie as I was using it. And part of this is also to sort of anticipate what some of the perceptions of a high-end tube amp might be. And again, I want to sort of clarify some of that here. The first one is that tubes add distortion, and that distortion is bad, and that we don't want this. We want a transparent source that doesn't have any sort of coloration or anything like that. With the Kenzie, that isn't what it sounds like. It doesn't sound like that's what's going on here. This is an extremely clean sounding amplifier as far as the tone and everything. And that speaks to the second consideration, which is that tube amps negatively impact the frequency response. They're not linear, and they add this coloration. And again, this one isn't like that. I mean, yes, there are other tube amps that do that, but not this one. I've heard tube amps that roll off in both the bass and in the treble, and that's been actually the most common experience I get with tube amps. One of the reasons why I've gravitated more towards solid state stuff, but that really doesn't apply to the Ampsandsound Kenzie. The third consideration is that people have said that tube amps are dirty, or there's maybe this perception that tube amps are dirty and less resolving than a highly transparent solid state amplifier. And again, not this one. That's not what this is like. Again, the counter example to that perception strongly. And then the last one is that tube amps are less convenient than solid state amplifiers. And to that, I have to say, yes, that's absolutely true. And it's still, I mean, the Kenzie is still a tube amplifier. And so some of the inconveniences that you have with tube amplifiers, they're a little bit picky. That's still applicable to the Kenzie. So if you have any interference from Wi-Fi signals or any other electronic components or anything like that, if you have a router next to the amplifier, you can pick up that kind of stuff. All right, so obviously I love the Ampsandsound Kenzie. I think it's a fantastic amplifier. I do want to point out a few oddities though, and it's that the inputs and outputs are on the back. So when you have it sort of like on a shelf or something like that, or a table, and it's facing forwards, the cables have to go all the way around to the back, and it's a bit weird. They did make this change with the Kenzie Encore, I believe, and some of the other models. So they've taken that feedback and implemented it. And also, this doesn't have any of those other outputs like, as a preamp or anything like that. So that's what some of the other models are there for. And once again, if you require really lots of power for like a Hi-Fi Man Sundara or something like that, you would want to go up to one of their other models, one of their higher end, more powerful models. So that's not really like a criticism of the Kenzie. It's just something to note that, depending on the headphones that you have, you may want to look into one model or another model, right, from Ampsandsound, because there's the Mogwai SE, and then a number of other ones as well. Hopefully I get that one in for review soon too. So let me give my conclusion here. Of course, I recommend the Kenzie. This is my favorite amplifier that I've heard so far, with the headphones that I have here. Yes, I love the pendant as well, and I don't think this is necessarily better than the pendant. In fact, I think that the pendant is more appropriate for the ZMF Verite, but potentially if you use this with different output impedance, whatever the impedance specs of the pendant are, maybe he could accommodate something like that. And if that's the case, then this would probably work just as well. So I don't think that this is better than the pendant. for the Verite, I think this is just a little bit different and in a way that is really, really interesting. Anyways, that does it for this review. Thanks for taking the time to watch it, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye for now.